this lecture I'm entitling The Structure of Matthew's Gospel. And to understand Matthew, we're going to take a very quick look at Mark, which one scholar has called a passion narrative with an extended introduction. Matthew's main source is Mark, and more on this in another lecture. Matthew reproduces about 80% of Mark. Luke reproduces about 50% of Mark, Matthew about 80%. So some more details on Mark, if we want to say more than a passion narrative with an extended introduction. We have a Galilean ministry beginning with the baptism of John. Then we have Holy Week in Jerusalem, followed by the passion narrative, and then there is a prophecy of resurrection appearances. The angel at the tomb says to the women, "Go to Galilee, there you will see him." Tell the disciples, "Go to Galilee, there you will see him." The women leave the tomb and say nothing to anybody. End of the gospel. That's how Mark ends, an abrupt ending. Now, Matthew's overall structure compared to Mark, he starts with an infancy narrative, then the Galilean ministry, the Holy Week in Jerusalem, the Passion narrative, a prophecy of resurrection appearances, and resurrection appearance narratives. So Matthew's major additions to Mark, the easiest ones to spot, are the very beginning, the infancy narratives, which serves as an overture. And I'm going to do one or two later lectures on an infancy narrative. But it serves as an overture to the rest of the gospel, and the resurrection appearance narratives. And I'm going to devote one or two lectures to those as well on another day. So those are his major additions. Now, let's see. I think I've got time. If not, I'll cut it out. My experience of overtures is very limited. Handel's Messiah, Jesus Christ Superstar, and Grease are the only ones I know. Let's take Superstar for an example. When you first go the first time, it's kind of like this is mood music. But after you've seen the rock opera a couple of times, then you're listening, dun, 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 and you say, apostles' music. Dun, 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 dun. Judas music. Dun, 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 dun. Mary Magdalene music. Okay, so what the overture, it's the last part written, and it gives you a preview of the rest. The infancy narrative functions as an overture. More of that in the detailed lecture. Now, Brown's outline of Matthew is a 7-part outline. He has the infancy narrative, the origin and infancy of Jesus the Messiah, and then he has, before he gets to the climax, the passion, death, and resurrection, he has 5 additional sections of the gospel, and these are built around the 5 discourses in Matthew. And before each discourse, there's narrative. So you get part 1, the proclamation of the kingdom, and the discourse there is the Sermon on the Mount. Then ministry and mission in Galilee. You get the narrative, and the discourse that ends that is called the mission sermon. Then there's questioning and opposition to Jesus, the narrative, and we get the sermon or the discourse on parables, concludes that. Part 4, his thoughts on Christology and ecclesiology, what the church is about, the narrative, followed with the sermon or the discourse on the church. Part 5, the journey to and ministry in Jerusalem. That's the narrative. And the eschatological discourse, the discourse about the end, brings that section to a close. And then the climax is the passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus. So narrative and discourse, Matthew structures the material between the infancy narrative and the passion narrative with narrative followed by discourse. And the 5 discourses, I've given them here to you. The Sermon on the Mount, the Mission Sermon, the Sermon in Parables, the Sermon on the Church, and the Eschatological Sermon. Now, 3 of these are Matthew's composition, and 2 of them are expansions of Mark. So the Sermon on Parables, that comes from Mark 4. Matthew has 52 verses, Mark has 41, so you can see that's expanded. And the eschatological discourse about the end, that's 37 verses in Mark, but it's 97 verses in Matthew. Well, let's see. I'll also say just a little bit about what I mean by Matthew's composition. The Sermon on the Mount is Matthew's composition. What we find in the Sermon on the Mount, a lot of that material is found scattered throughout Luke's Gospel. Matthew has taken things said by Jesus on many different occasions, miles apart, weeks and months, maybe years apart, and put them into one thematic sermon. That's what I mean. So I'm not saying that Matthew wrote this from scratch. What I'm saying is that he took sayings of Jesus and built them into the Sermon on the Mount, and probably the same with others. So that's what I mean when I say it's his composition. Not that he wrote it from scratch, but that he's assembling different Jesus materials. Basically, what Matthew does with the extra material, he puts it into sermons, structured by theme. What Luke does is, in Mark and Matthew, the journey from Galilee to Jerusalem takes 1 chapter. In Luke, it takes 10 chapters. And so he has the story of Jesus eating and drinking his way from Galilee to Jerusalem, telling parables and dining with people along the way. And he puts the extra Jesus material that he has that's not in Mark in the journey narrative. So Mark serves as the basic structure for both of them, but Matthew handles the Mark and other material differently. Matthew is longer than Mark. We've seen Matthew has added the infancy narrative, 2 chapters, and resurrection appearances, most of chapter 28. The other major reason for Matthew's increased length are the 3 additional sermons and discourses that he includes. He has also expanded the 2 discourses that he took over from Mark. And the 5 discourses, my last remarks here, some have proposed that the 5 discourses correspond to the 5 volumes of the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Brown thinks that that hypothesis is unlikely. However, there are parallels between Jesus and Moses. And these parallels between Jesus and Moses are a common feature of the Gospel of Matthew, and I will be dealing with those in a future lecture.